The fluorescent lights hum their mechanical hymn. Natalie Hayes pushes through the pedestrian doors at Oak Creek Memorial at 6:02 a.m., the same time she arrives every morning, the time carved into her muscle memory like a scar. Her scrubs are 2 sizes too large, deliberate. Her badge hangs at an angle. Her limp is subtle enough that most people don't notice, a favor her left knee learned to give her after a blast in Sanjin Valley rewired her nervous system, after she spent 3 months in a forward surgical team tent learning to walk on titanium and trauma. The medication cart at the pediatric station is where she starts. Always the medication cart. It is a small station, a corner of the world where she can be useful without being seen. Her hands move through the alphabetized 4 bags with the precision of someone who has already performed 15 field surgeries in 12 hours without a single tremor. Nobody at Oak Creek knows this. Nobody knows her. She wears invisibility the way other nurses wear confidence. The hallway outside pediatrics smells like antiseptic and the peculiar staleness of air-conditioned institutions, that smell of recycled hope and chemical cleanliness that never quite masks the scent of suffering underneath. She passes Emma Cortez's room without stopping. The girl is there, visible through the small window in the door, sitting on the hospital bed with her back against the wall. 3 weeks ago Emma had a full head of dark hair. Now the pillowcase beside her holds the evidence of what the 12 doctors have failed to explain. Hair loss. Progressive. Inexplicable. The medical term is alopecia areata, or stress alopecia, or nutritional deficiency, or psychosomatic, or the doctors had simply stopped answering when the parents kept asking why. The general is pacing the corridor. Marine General Derek Cortez, dress blues pressed sharper than his jaw, walking in tight circuits like a perimeter guard. His voice comes through the phone pressed against his ear with the controlled tension of a man used to giving orders to people who follow them without question. No. No. That's not acceptable. My daughter needs a diagnosis, not a consultation schedule. A pause. I don't care if it takes all night. Find someone who knows what they're doing. He ends the call. The silence that follows is the silence of a man who has run out of ranks to pull. Natalie continues to the medication station. She doesn't meet his eyes. She has learned the choreography of invisibility, shoulders forward, eyes down, movements efficient but never hurried, never commanding attention. Just a nurse. Just someone here to do the work that others have deemed beneath them. Dr. Ashford arrives at 7:15 a.m., his presence announced by the particular way the hallway changes. The residents part. The nursing staff straightens. He moves through pediatrics like a man who owns the building, which, in the hierarchy of white coats and institutional authority, he effectively does. Chief of Pediatrics. Board certified. Hospital publication photo on the 2nd floor. His white coat is pressed sharp enough to cut, and his eyes move across the floor like a man counting inventory. He passes Natalie at the medication cart and nods once, the minimum acknowledgement a human gives another human they do not see. She nods back, her chin lowering just slightly, her jaw remaining steady, her voice remaining absent. This is the language they speak. This is the only conversation he allows. 3 residents trail behind him like attendants in a mobile court. They are young, hungry, bright with the kind of exhaustion that comes from learning they still have so much to learn. He leads them toward Emma's room, and Natalie notices the smallest thing, the way General Cortez straightens when he sees the white coats approaching, the way his shoulders shift from the posture of exhaustion back into something approximating command. Natalie finishes the medication cart and moves to patient rooms. Emma Cortez is the 3rd one. She knocks once, waits for the muffled "come in," and enters the space where a child sits surrounded by the machinery of modern medicine. The heart monitor traces its reassuring rhythm, beep, 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 the sound of a body that is physically intact but somehow failing. The 4-line threads into Emma's small hand, taped down with the careful precision that pediatric nursing demands. And on the pillow beside her, unmissable if you are actually looking, are the clumps of dark hair. Emma looks up. She is 8 years old, with the particular combination of bravery and exhaustion that children develop when hospitals become home. "Hi," she says, and there is a question in the word. "Hi, Emma. I'm Natalie. How are you feeling this morning?" Natalie moves with the practiced ease of someone who has asked this question 10,000 times, who has learned to move around hospital beds the way other people move through rooms they know by heart. "I want to go home." It is not an answer to the question she was asked. It is the only truth Emma knows how to speak anymore. "I know you do." Natalie checks the line, the monitor, the notation in the chart. She moves with the efficiency of someone taking inventory of broken things. The hair loss is documented. Progressive alopecia. Cause unknown. Standard panels unremarkable. And then her eyes stop on something else, something the doctors have missed because they are looking at the tests instead of looking at the child. There, on the windowsill, partially hidden behind the water pitcher, is a collection of small objects. Toy soldiers. Antique ones, the kind with the kind of weight to them that comes from lead paint, from manufacturing practices that happened before anyone understood what lead could do to a developing body. Natalie picks up one of the soldiers. It is heavier than it should be. She turns it slowly, studying the detail, the craftsmanship, the particular sheen of aged lead. Emma's eyes follow her hand. "Those are from Daddy's collection. He let me bring them to keep me company." Emma's voice is small. "Are they bad?" Natalie sets the soldier down carefully on the windowsill. "No, baby. They're beautiful." But even as she says it, something is clicking into place in her mind, something that the 12 doctors have missed because they were trained to look for diseases, not for the slow accumulation of everyday poisons. Lead exposure. Chronic. Progressive. The kind of poisoning that manifests as hair loss first, because the body knows to reject what it cannot process. She makes a notation in the chart. Her handwriting is precise, economical, the kind of handwriting that comes from writing reports in hostile environments where every word might determine whether someone lives or dies. Emma has toys with lead paint. Test for heavy metal poisoning. Simple. Clear. Easy to miss if you are not actually listening. General Cortez is in the hallway when she exits. He is still pacing, still the picture of controlled desperation. She does not speak to him. Just a nurse does not offer unsolicited opinions to Marine generals, does not interrupt the chain of command, does not presume. That night, after her shift ends at 7 p.m., Natalie stands at the bus stop in San Diego rain. The water falls like applause, steady and insistent, and she pulls her jacket tighter. Underneath the lining, her fingers find the faded unit patch, the insignia of the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force, carefully unpicked from her field jacket 18 months ago when she became a ghost. Major Natalie Hayes, callsign Valkyrie, ceased to exist the day the extraction in Kandahar went sideways. 3 senators decided the mission never happened. The Corps erased her from every database. She was told to vanish into civilian life or face court-martial for operations she could never discuss. She remembers Kandahar like remembering a nightmare you cannot quite wake from. The patrol through Jolan district. The IED. Her team pinned down in a compound with 2 wounded Marines and a rising tide of fire. She remembers the decision, leave them or stay and die. She stayed. She performed a field thoracotomy with a combat knife and a prayer, opened a chest cavity with nothing but determination and the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She extracted both wounded Marines, dragged them 200 meters under fire, got them to the medevac helicopter with 30 seconds to spare. 17 lives. That is what she saved during those 3 tours. 17 people who walked out of Kandahar because she was there when they were not supposed to make it out at all. The bus arrives. She boards. She pays her fare. She sits in the back, her hand still touching the unit patch through the jacket lining, her mind returning to Emma's small face and the toy soldiers heavy with the poison of decades. 12 doctors. 12 different conclusions. 12 failures to see what was actually in front of them. She closes her eyes. Inside the medication cart tomorrow, inside the hallways and the charts and the careful performance of invisibility, she carries the knowledge that nobody else seems to possess. Emma Cortez is being poisoned by something beautiful. And the child is running out of time. The rain hammers against the bus windows. Natalie's reflection stares back at her, a ghost in scrubs, and she knows what is about to begin. It always begins this way. With someone dying. With people too frightened to act. With a decision that will cost her everything she has already lost. Morning rounds began like every other morning at Oak Creek Memorial, the shuffle of white coats, the mechanical beeping of monitors, the whisper of charts being reviewed. Dr. Ashford stood at the foot of Emma Cortez's bed, his tailored blazer crisp despite the early hour, his silver pen poised over the girl's medical file like a weapon he'd learned to wield through years of institutional power. General Cortez stood at the bedside, still in uniform despite 3 weeks of vigil in a chair designed for people half his size, watching his daughter's reflection in the darkened window. Emma lay still, her scalp now a landscape of bald patches, wisps of hair scattered across the pillowcase like evidence of something being stolen in the dark. Another autoimmune panel, Ashford announced. His voice carried the kind of certainty that made it impossible to contradict him. We'll also run a complete metabolic workup and consult with rheumatology again. The pattern is consistent with lupus or alopecia areata. Natalie stood in the corner of the room, hands holding the medication tray with the kind of stillness that comes from learning not to move unless instructed. She had been a field medic in Kandahar, diagnosing shock at 30 meters, making life-or-death decisions while rounds exploded like they were part of the morning briefing. Now she stood silent while 12 different doctors ordered the same tests over and over, their conclusions circling the drain. But that wasn't what she saw when she looked at Emma Cortez. She saw the tremor in the child's hands. She saw the way the general kept his daughter's antique toy soldiers lined up on the bedside table, painted replicas from his own childhood, he'd mentioned once, their surfaces chipped and worn. She saw the dark discoloration at Emma's gum line, subtle but unmistakable to someone trained to read the body's whispered warnings. The beeping of the monitors filled the silence. Steady. Mechanical. Indifferent. Dr. Ashford, Natalie said quietly. The words came out soft, careful, deferential. A nurse's voice. The pattern resembles environmental toxin exposure. The hair loss, the gastrointestinal complaints, the tremors. Have we tested for heavy metals? The room changed temperature. Ashford's pen stopped moving. His jaw shifted slightly, a muscle working beneath his jawline like something trying to escape. He turned slowly to face her, and in that moment, Natalie understood she had just made a choice that would cost her something. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, cold, clear, and merciless. Nurses do not contradict attending physicians, Miss Hayes. His voice didn't rise. That was the dangerous part. His voice was perfectly calm, perfectly controlled, the sound of a man so secure in his power that he didn't need to shout. Your job is to administer medications and monitor vital signs. Not to practice medicine. Not to hypothesize. Not to suggest diagnoses that contradict the collective assessment of 12 specialists. He turned back to General Cortez as if Natalie had already ceased to exist. I apologize for the interference, General. We've consulted with rheumatologists, immunologists, neurologists, the finest minds in their respective fields. This is clearly autoimmune in nature. We simply need to identify which condition and adjust our immunosuppressive therapy accordingly. General Cortez's expression didn't change. But his eyes, grey eyes that had stared down enemy combatants across deserts and mountains, moved to Natalie for exactly 2 seconds. In that glance was something she recognized. The look of a commander who knows his intelligence officer has just seen something critical and that someone in the chain of command doesn't want to hear it. Natalie took one measured breath. Her hands remained steady on the medication tray. The plastic made no sound because her grip was perfect, not panicked, not trembling, just controlled. One tear escaped. It ran down her cheek with the inevitability of gravity. She wiped it with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with Ashford. When she spoke, her voice had changed. It was quieter now, and quietness in a room like this was louder than screaming. That little girl is dying, and your ego is killing her. The monitors beeped. Emma coughed. Someone dropped something in the hallway outside. Ashford's jaw tightened. "You're dismissed, Miss Hayes. Return to your station." She set the medication tray on the counter and walked out of the room with the kind of composure that comes from having already lost everything that mattered and discovering it doesn't actually destroy you. The break room at Oak Creek Memorial was a place where time moved differently than in the rest of the hospital. Here, time moved backward. Here, the hierarchy that Ashford reinforced through shift assignments and performance reviews became visible like geological layers in sedimentary rock. The attending physicians occupied the refrigerator. The residents got the microwave area. The nurses assembled in the middle in their prescribed zones. Natalie entered carrying a plastic container of leftover soup from the day before, lentil, homemade, something she'd learned to cook during the 18 months after Kandahar when she'd rented an apartment in San Diego under a name that wasn't her name and tried to figure out what a person did when the government decided she'd never existed. The food had been her anchor. Routine. Something that required measuring and timing and following protocols. For nurses sat at the center table, Martinez, who'd worked pediatrics for 11 years, Chen, who was kind but careful about her career, Reeves, who had a daughter on a soccer team, and Holloway, who'd made the mistake of having lunch with Natalie twice before the unspoken rules became clear. Natalie approached the table. "May I sit?" Martinez gathered her sandwich. Chen followed. Reeves looked at Holloway, who was still chewing, then Reeves stood up too. They moved as a unit to the far corner table, carrying their lunches like they were evacuating. No one was rude about it. There was no confrontation, no spoken rejection. Just the sound of chairs scraping tile as the space around Natalie expanded into something that looked like isolation but was actually just the natural result of hierarchy enforcement. She sat alone at the empty table. The soup smelled like turmeric and cinnamon. She ate it slowly with a plastic spoon that scraped against the Tupperware container in a rhythm that sounded like nothing at all. Around her, the 4 nurses spoke in low voices. She heard her name twice. Ashford's name once. The word insubordination drifted across the room like smoke. She finished eating, cleaned her container, and stood to leave. As she passed Martinez's table, Martinez looked up. For a moment, Natalie thought there might be something there, a crack in the professional facade, a small opening where another human being lived. But Martinez's eyes slid away. She turned back to her salad. The door closed behind Natalie with a soft hydraulic hiss. That evening, the unit board at the nurses' station displayed the shift assignments, emergency protocols, and administrative updates that guided the day-to-day operations of pediatrics at Oak Creek Memorial. At 4:33 p.m., Dr. Ashford arrived with a piece of paper. The disciplinary notice was printed in official hospital letterhead. The font was professional. The language was precise. Disciplinary notice. Employee, Natalie Hayes, RN, Pediatric Unit. Date. Violation, overstepping scope of practice and undermining medical authority. Details, employee made unsolicited clinical suggestions to attending physician in presence of patient family. Employee contradicted physician assessment without consultation or evidence. Pattern indicates systemic disregard for institutional hierarchy and physician-led treatment protocols. Action, final written warning. Any additional violations will result in termination proceedings. Ashford pinned it to the board with the kind of deliberate precision that made sure everyone would see it. Then he stood there for 17 seconds, making sure people noticed he was the one who'd posted it. When he left, he made it clear he was walking toward the administrative offices. 3 nurses read the notice. Holloway lingered longest, her eye scanning every word. When she turned away, she glanced toward the crash cart where Natalie was refilling for supplies, a job that no one had explicitly assigned to her but that she'd taken on anyway. Their eyes met for half a second. Holloway's expression was something between sympathy and warning. Then she whispered something to Martinez and Chen, who both glanced in Natalie's direction before returning to their documentation. Natalie continued organizing supplies. For gauges from 20 to 26. Saline flushes in ascending order. Adhesive patches arranged by size. Each motion was precise. Each action was exactly what was needed. This was the part of being a soldier that no one talked about, not the combat, not the wounds, not the losses. The part where you kept moving forward because stopping meant acknowledging that you'd already lost and that sometimes there was nothing left but to simply continue. Her hands moved with the kind of muscle memory that came from a decade of combat deployments. She didn't tremble. She didn't let the fluorescent lights and the weight of institutional hostility change how she moved or what she accomplished. That night, Dr. Ashford sat in his office and made 3 phone calls. The first was to Richard Bancroft, the hospital administrator, a man whose greatest achievement had been inheriting a position his father had held before him. Richard, I need to document a personnel issue before it escalates. One of our pediatric nurses has been directly contradicting physician assessments and making unsolicited clinical suggestions. I've issued a written warning, but I wanted to alert you to a potential liability situation. The second call was to Dr. Marcus Wellington, the chief of medicine and Ashford's mentor, the man who'd championed his appointment as chief of pediatrics 8 years ago and who maintained significant influence over hospital board decisions. Marcus, I have a situation that needs to be handled carefully. A nursing staff member has been undermining my authority in front of patients and families. I'm concerned about the message this sends regarding physician-led treatment protocols. I've documented everything formally. The third call was to HR, to Diane Peterman, who recorded his concerns about Natalie's pattern of insubordination and updated her personnel file accordingly. By 8:27 p.m., 3 separate systems within Oak Creek Memorial had been activated in concert. The machinery of institutional power, once engaged, moved with the momentum of something that had never been required to stop. Natalie stood in the hallway at 11:44 p.m., staring at the disciplinary notice still pinned to the unit board. The late-night lighting made the paper look almost translucent, like something that wasn't quite real. She took one measured breath. The air smelled like antiseptic and the particular staleness that accumulates in hospitals after visiting hours end and the building settles into its nocturnal rhythm. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. One tear escaped. She wiped it with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with the notice, without breaking eye contact with the representation of everything that kept her contained, everything that kept her small, everything that demanded she remain beneath people whose only qualification was that they'd arrived first. That little girl is dying, she whispered to the empty hallway, and your ego is killing her. The monitors beeped their indifferent rhythm down the corridor. Somewhere in a room 83 beds away, Emma Cortez was losing more hair while 12 doctors' diagnoses circled the drain and a little girl's father stood vigil in a chair that wasn't built for the weight of his helplessness. What Natalie didn't know was that in exactly 36 hours, Emma's heart would stop. The fluorescent lights above Emma's bed hummed their monotonous electric hymn as Natalie pushed the medication cart down the third-floor corridor at Oak Creek Memorial, her scrubs still damp from the pre-dawn shift briefing. 48 hours had passed since Dr. Ashford's disciplinary notice appeared on the unit board, and in that time, something fundamental had shifted in the hospital's atmosphere, not a change you could measure on any instrument, but the kind nurses learned to read in the set of a doctor's jaw and the way colleagues suddenly needed to be elsewhere when you entered the break room. What Natalie understood with the clarity that came from 17 years of reading life-or-death situations in the worst places on Earth was this: the clock was running, and it was running fast. Emma Cortez's condition had begun its descent at 3:17 a.m., though no one had marked that exact moment as the pivot point. It was the small things first, the child's increased restlessness, the way she pulled at her remaining hair in her sleep, the dark circles under her eyes that had deepened from shadows to bruises. Natalie had observed from a distance because that was all Ashford would permit now, keeping her assignment strategically rotated so she was never on Emma's ward at the same time, never able to access the medical charts that might have confirmed what she already knew in her bones. 36 hours into the deterioration, Emma's hair loss had accelerated to the kind of shedding that sent nurses into quiet conferences in supply closets, entire patches coming loose when the child's mother ran a gentle hand across her scalp. The medication team reported visible trembling in Emma's extremities. The labs came back inconclusive again, and again, and again. Natalie had learned long ago that observation without action was a different kind of violence. She'd held that truth in her hands in the outskirts of Kandahar when 3 Marines bled out while she waited for permission from command that never came. So at 4:43 a.m. on day 49 of Emma's hospitalization, she positioned herself at the corner station where she had a line of sight to room 312, where the child lay in the institutional semi-darkness, and she watched. This was what she had been trained to do, what she was genuinely gifted at, the accumulation of small, specific details that no one else thought to connect. Muscle memory that predated nursing by more than a decade. Pain as data. Symptoms as a story waiting to be read. Emma was fidgeting again. Natalie could see it even from this distance, the child's small hands moving restlessly across the hospital blanket, fingers flexing as if remembering something her conscious mind had forgotten. Natalie set down her medication tray and allowed herself 3 seconds of stillness, watching the pattern. Emma's fingers would move, then settle, then move again. The child would glance toward her hospital gown pocket with the particular fixation of a child trying not to think about something. It took Natalie 4 observation cycles, roughly 6 minutes, to understand what Emma was doing. The toy soldiers. The antique ones in the pocket. Emma was reaching for them without reaching, the way a person who knows they shouldn't touch something becomes obsessed with not touching it. During the 7:15 a.m. shift change, Natalie found an excuse to pass Emma's room. The door was ajar, and General Cortez was asleep in the chair beside his daughter's bed, his uniform jacket folded precisely over the back, a man still maintaining military standards even in the midst of his daughter's crisis, a man whose entire life had taught him that discipline and order were how you kept things from falling apart. Emma was awake, staring at the ceiling with the flat effect of a child who had moved beyond pain into something more fundamental. Natalie could see the child's hand near the pocket of her gown, not quite touching the fabric. She saw the slight tremor in that small hand. She observed the way Emma's breathing had shifted into the shallow pattern of someone whose body was working harder than it should be just to move air. That was when Natalie noticed what none of the 12 doctors had thought to look for. Emma's fingers were swollen. Not dramatically, not in the kind of way that would set off alarms, but swollen with the particular puffiness that comes from systemic exposure to something the body can't process or excrete. The child's nails had taken on a faint discoloration at the beds, barely visible, but there if you knew to look. Natalie had seen it before in a Marine corporal named Patterson who'd handled ammunition casings with bare hands for 6 months, the same metallic tint creeping in at the edges. The same slow poisoning, invisible until it wasn't. She continued her rounds with practiced normalcy, but her mind had already begun the timeline reconstruction that Ashford had forbidden her to perform. 2 weeks before Emma's hair loss began. That was the exposure window. She'd noted it in her private assessment log, the one she kept in her locker and never mentioned to anyone because that log existed in the grey space between nursing observations and insubordination. 2 weeks prior to the hair loss. What had changed in Emma's environment 2 weeks before that? What had the child suddenly acquired? The antique toy soldiers. Grandfather's gift. Natalie had overheard that conversation between Emma and her mother 4 days ago, when she'd been delivering morning vitals and thought herself unobserved. The child had mentioned them by name, the old painted ones, the kind that were probably decades old, possibly from the 1950s or earlier. Natalie's mind did the math with the terrifying speed of someone who triaged mass casualty situations. Old painted toys meant lead-based paint. Lead exposure would cause hair loss within 2 weeks. Lead would cause swelling of the extremities. Lead would cause the metallic taste that Emma had mentioned to the night nurse, a complaint that had been documented and filed and completely ignored because it didn't fit any of the 12 diagnoses the doctors had already established and defended. She needed to verify the timeline. That was the next step. That was the piece that would complete the puzzle in a way that even Ashford couldn't dismiss. But when she went to access Emma's chart at the computer station at 8:53 a.m., she found her login credentials had been restricted. Not disabled entirely, she could still access her own assignments and her own patients, but Emma's medical file was no longer available to her. The restriction notification came with Ashford's electronic signature and a timestamp from 6:33 a.m. He'd moved quickly. He'd anticipated exactly what she would do next. Natalie stared at the screen, watching the denial icon cycle, and she allowed exactly 1 second of response, the kind of pause that most people would interpret as frustration but that actually represented the moment when she accepted that the institutional path forward had been deliberately blocked. This was a strategic move, executed with the kind of bureaucratic precision that Ashford wielded like a scalpel. He couldn't prevent her from noticing Emma's deterioration. He couldn't forbid her from understanding basic medical symptoms. But he could isolate her from the systems that would have given her the authority to act, and he could do it all within the hospital's official protocols. The shift assignments had been changed too. Natalie discovered this when she checked the unit board at 9:12 a.m. Emma's care had been shifted to the day team, and Natalie's schedule had been adjusted, rotated to the opposite shift. She would be working nights for the next 2 weeks, which meant no overlap with Emma's ward rounds, no access to the same nurses who might have compared observations, no possibility of influencing the diagnostic path. Ashford's power source was institutional hierarchy, the kind of authority that made such moves possible within the hospital's operational structure. He was the chief of pediatrics. He controlled shift assignments. He managed the electronic medical record access protocols. He had positioned himself at the fulcrum of the system, and he had leverage over performance reviews, unit placement, and the trajectories of nursing careers. Natalie's badge felt heavier than usual as she clipped it back onto her scrubs. The brass was worn now from 4 years of consecutive shifts, the lanyard frayed at the edges. None of the other nurses met her eyes as she moved through the station. This was the isolation phase. This was what professional ostracism looked like in a place where people were supposed to be working together to save lives. In the corner of the break room, 3 nurses gathered their lunch bags when she arrived, a silent choreography of rejection that would have broken most people. She was not most people. She had walked through deserts where the temperature exceeded 130 degrees with a severed artery in her left thigh and kept moving because stopping meant dying. She had held a dying 18-year-old on the floor of a military hospital in Bagram while rounds of incoming fire hammered the walls above her head, and she had not moved except to apply direct pressure to the wound. Institutional hierarchy was a gentle thing compared to what she'd already survived. But gentle things could still kill children. Natalie clocked out at 3:35 p.m. and sat in her car in the hospital parking lot for exactly 16 minutes, the engine off, her hands resting on the steering wheel. Rain had begun to fall in the San Diego afternoon, not hard, just the kind of soft persistent drizzle that darkened the asphalt and created small rivers between the parking spaces. She knew what Ashford expected. He expected her to follow the system, to accept the restrictions, to understand that she was just a nurse and that doctors made the decisions in institutions like this. He expected her to eventually accept the termination notice that she was certain would be drafted by week's end. What he didn't understand was that Natalie Hayes had lived in systems that made Oak Creek Memorial's hierarchy look like a child's game. She had operated in environments where the only authority that mattered was competence under pressure and where people's lives depended on being willing to exceed your mandate when the situation demanded it. Emma Cortez was failing. The medical team had 12 diagnoses and 0 solutions. And somewhere in that child's hospital gown pocket, there were antique toy soldiers with lead-based paint that were slowly poisoning her to death, one exposure at a time. The rain continued to fall. A helicopter passed overhead, heading toward the naval base at North Island, its rotors cutting through the wet air with that distinctive thump-thump-thump that never quite stopped sounding like distant gunfire. Natalie watched it disappear into the grey afternoon sky and understood with the clarity of someone trained to make decisions with incomplete information that the next move was going to require her to think beyond protocol. The next move was going to require her to be something more dangerous than a nurse following policy. The next move was going to require her to remember who she actually was, just for long enough to save a child's life. She turned the key in the ignition and pulled out of the parking lot, knowing that she had roughly 16 hours before Emma's night shift began, and she was going to spend them putting together the evidence that Ashford's restrictions were designed to prevent her from assembling. She had a lifetime of skills in gathering intelligence from fragmented information. She had a combat medic's understanding of heavy metal poisoning. She had something that no institutional hierarchy could actually take away from her, the absolute certainty that in this moment, a child's survival depended on her willingness to break the rules that had been designed specifically to keep her powerless. The monitor's alarm cut through the corridor like a scalpel through silk. Emma Cortez's oxygen saturation had plummeted to 62%, and her airway, the 112 doctors had declared stable just hours before, was swelling shut like a fist closing around her throat. The anaphylaxis wasn't to medication. It was to the lead particulates still embedding themselves in her tissues, triggering a cascade of inflammation that no antihistamine could reverse. The code team assembled in room for 12 with the coordinated chaos of practice, crash cart, defibrillator pads, residents positioning themselves according to a hierarchy that meant nothing when a child was dying. Dr. Ashford stood at the foot of the bed, already formulating the narrative. Equipment malfunction. Misdiagnosis by nursing. Anything but the diagnosis he'd rejected 3 days ago. The residents froze. They'd trained for cardiac arrest. They'd memorized algorithms. But this was different. Emma's small body convulsed as her airway swelled, and the resident stood paralyzed, waiting for someone senior to make the decision, to take the risk, to do the thing nobody wanted to say aloud, that she needed a surgical airway and none of them had trained for it outside of a simulator. Ashford's face had gone the color of chalk. His voice wavered. Get respiratory in here. Get anesthesia. Someone was already dialing. Someone else was drawing up medications that wouldn't work. The machine beeped its urgent rhythm, heart rate 190, oxygen saturation dropping like a stone. 48%. 44. 40. 3 doors down, Natalie heard it. The specific pattern of that alarm, the one that meant airway compromise, meant minutes, meant now. She didn't think. She dropped her supply cart. The crash of metal on tile echoed through the corridor as she moved, and muscle memory took over, not the hesitant movement of a nurse following protocol, but the explosive efficiency of a combat medic responding to casualties. Her scrubs whispered against her legs as she accelerated, her trauma shears already in her pocket where they always were, the ones with the callsign Valkyrie etched into the handle so faded that only she could read it anymore. The pen came from Dr. Ashford's jacket pocket as she shoved past the first resident. He didn't see it as theft. He was too stunned by her presence, by the way she moved through the code team like they were furniture. "What are you?" Ashford started. The sound was small, incomplete. She snapped the ballpoint pen in half with one hand, the plastic cracking like a joint popping back into place. She had already palpated Emma's throat, already located the cricothyroid membrane, that narrow band of cartilage between 2 larger rings, the emergency window into the airway that combat medics used in fields with no surgeons, no lights, no time. Her fingers found it without hesitation. The blade came from the crash cart suture kit. 14-gauge surgical steel, sharp enough to part skin like water. 1 vertical incision, clean, decisive. Emma's eyes went wide but she couldn't scream because there was nothing to scream through. Natalie's hands moved with the terrifying precision of someone who had done this before, who had done this in desert dust with artillery shaking the ground, who had done this while her own blood ran down her ribs. She separated the tissues, created the space, inserted the hollow pen casing through the membrane into the trachea below. Emma's chest rose. Actually rose. The gasp came out like a small animal finally understanding it could breathe again. Oxygen saturation started climbing. 60. 70. 80. The monitor's rhythm shifted from the frantic beeping of emergency to the steadier pulse of a body remembering how to survive. Natalie kept her hand on the makeshift airway, feeling Emma's breath move through the pen casing, through her palm, proof of function. Blood covered her hands up to the wrists. The room had gone utterly silent except for the monitor and the sound of Emma's breathing, ragged, desperate, alive. The resident stared. One of them still had a syringe in her hand, medication for a problem that had just been solved in 6 seconds by a woman in scrubs performing what should have been impossible. Natalie didn't look at Ashford. She looked at the residents, her voice dropping to command register, each word hitting with the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Test the toy soldiers in her pocket. Lead levels. Catastrophic. She turned to the code cart, already reaching for the medications Emma actually needed, the chelation protocol that would start the process of binding the lead before it damaged her organs beyond repair. A resident moved without thinking, already pulling the antique toy soldiers from Emma's hospital gown pocket, the ones the child had been keeping, the ones she'd fidgeted with constantly, the ones coated in lead paint that had been slowly poisoning her for months. The lab tech ran them through the analyzer. The result came back in 4 minutes. Lead levels 18 times the lethal threshold. 18 times. And Emma was still alive. Still breathing through a ballpoint pen. Still fighting because someone had recognized that institutional hierarchy meant nothing when a child was dying. Emma's oxygen saturation stabilized at 92%. Her heart rate dropped from 190 to 112. Normal sinus rhythm. The words that no resident would say out loud, but all of them were thinking, Major Natalie Hayes had just saved a child's life using equipment that cost less than a cup of coffee. Dr. Ashford's face had gone through several colors, white, then red, then a shade of purple that suggested blood pressure reaching dangerous levels. General Cortez stood in the doorway, and when Natalie glanced up, she saw something in his expression shift. It was the look of someone recognizing competence at a level that transcended explanation. "How did you?" he started. "Everyone out. Now." Ashford's voice cracked like a whip. The residents moved. The attending on the code team moved. Only Natalie didn't move, her hand still stabilizing Emma's airway, her eyes on the child's oxygen saturation climbing toward 95. Ashford pulled her into the corridor, and his voice dropped low enough that only she could hear it, which made it somehow worse than if he'd screamed. "You just performed an unauthorized surgical procedure on a pediatric patient. You assaulted a physician. I have 12 witnesses." Natalie turned to face him. Her scrubs were soaked with Emma's blood. Her hands had stopped trembling the moment she'd made the incision. They were steady as a surgical laser now, steady as they'd been in Kandahar, steady as they'd been when she'd carried a Marine lieutenant 2 miles through Taliban fire with a sucking chest wound and no way to stop the bleeding except pressure, movement, and the absolute refusal to leave anyone behind. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence between them was thick enough that you could operate in it. Within the hour, toxicology confirmed lead levels of 2,200 micrograms per deciliter in Emma's blood. Safe exposure was 0. Emma was transferred to ICU for emergency chelation therapy. A cardiology consult was ordered because lead poisoning causes arrhythmias. A neurology consult was ordered because lead crosses the blood-brain barrier and damages children's developing brains. 12 doctors would eventually file reports trying to explain how they'd missed this diagnosis. The answer was simple: they hadn't been willing to listen to a nurse. 2 hours after Emma was stabilized, security arrived at the pediatric unit. Ashford had made his calls. The hospital administrator had confirmed termination pending investigation for gross negligence and scope of practice violations. Natalie was escorted from the building by 2 security guards who wouldn't meet her eyes, her badge deactivated, her access cards cancelled, her career at Oak Creek Memorial ending the way it always was supposed to end, quietly, effectively, without fanfare or acknowledgement. The paperwork was already being prepared for her reassignment to night janitorial duty pending formal termination proceedings. That evening, she stood at a rain-soaked bus stop in downtown San Diego, clutching a cardboard box that someone had given her from the break room. Rain hammered the pavement like applause, steady and cold. Inside the box, a cracked coffee mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" from a Secret Santa 3 years ago, a dying succulent that had never quite adapted to hospital break room fluorescence, and a photograph printed on standard military photo paper. 9 Marines in desert camouflage, standing in front of a FOB command tent in Kandahar. Helmets off, faces hard with the kind of exhaustion that comes from surviving things that can't be discussed. All of them smiling because they were alive and that was the only victory that mattered. All of them dead now. Officially by training accident. The cards had said memorial service. The truth was that a classified extraction had gone sideways, 3 senators had decided the mission never happened, and the Corps had erased Major Natalie Hayes from every database and told her to disappear into civilian life or face court-martial for operations she could never discuss. 2 years she'd been hiding at Oak Creek Memorial. 2 years of being called just a nurse and accepting it because the alternative was prison. 2 years of watching Ashford dismiss her expertise because she didn't have doctor in front of her name. 2 years of being invisible. The cardboard box was coming apart, the rain turning it soft. She didn't move from the bus stop. Her scrubs were still damp with Emma's blood. She didn't have an apartment. She didn't have a future. She had a child's life saved and a photograph of 9 dead Marines and the absolute certainty that the moment she got on that bus, everything would change in ways she couldn't predict or control. Rain hammered the parking lot like ammunition against the asphalt. Natalie stood at the bus stop with the cardboard box pressed against her ribs, her scrubs still damp from the night shift, the smell of antiseptic clinging to the fabric like evidence. 3 months of quiet competence. 12 doctors who missed it. 1 8-year-old girl whose body had stopped tolerating their incompetence somewhere around hour 47. The box contained a cracked coffee mug she'd bought at a thrift store in 2022, a succulent that had stopped being green around the same time she stopped sleeping through the night, and a photograph in a plastic sleeve. 9 faces. 9 Marines. All of them listed as killed in a training accident at Fort Bragg. Officially. Actually, they died in a warehouse in Kandahar that had never existed on any map, extracting 3 senators' sons from a hostage situation that had never been classified until it was classified so deep that the Pentagon simply pretended the operation had never occurred. Natalie was the only one who walked out. The Corps made her choice clear: disappear into civilian life or face court-martial for operations she could never discuss. 2 years. She'd made it 2 years. The bus was 4 minutes late, according to the digital sign at the shelter. Natalie didn't watch the countdown. She watched the hospital across the street, its lobby windows glowing against the rain-soaked darkness like a stage set in the final act of something unsalvageable. Dr. Ashford was still inside. She could feel it the way you feel a sniper in a window you can't see, the weight of his presence, his desperation making the very air feel compressed and dangerous. What happened inside Oak Creek Memorial in the 30 minutes after Emma's airway opened happened the way all institutional violence happens, methodically, through channels, with documentation and procedure and the kind of competent cruelty that only organizations can deploy. Dr. Ashford had strode from the resuscitation bay to the administrative corridor without looking back. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. His mind was already 3 moves ahead, the way brilliant men calculate advantage even when they're drowning. The emergency board meeting he convened at 11:38 p.m. included the hospital administrator Marcus Chen, Dr. Patricia Vance from the board's quality committee, and Thomas Berkshire from the medical executive council, Ashford's mentor, the man who had covered for his falsified research data 15 years ago at Johns Hopkins and had been quietly complicit ever since. "We have a critical liability situation," Ashford said, arranging his documents across the mahogany conference table like a prosecutor presenting evidence. Nurse Hayes performed an emergency cricothyrotomy on a pediatric patient without physician supervision, without anesthesia, without a surgical field. She used hospital equipment not designated for that procedure. She made a unilateral clinical decision that violated our entire chain of command structure. Chen's face was carefully neutral. Vance was already taking notes. The girl's airway was swelling shut. Her oxygen saturation was 47%, Chen said quietly. Which is precisely why we have protocols. We have equipment. We have physicians trained in emergency airway management. If we allow nurses to override clinical judgment because they disagree with a diagnosis, we're not running a hospital, we're running a lottery. Ashford's voice never rose. This was the voice of a man who understood that volume was for people without institutional power. The liability exposure is catastrophic. 1 lawsuit from the parents if this child has any complications, and we're facing 8 figures in damages. Our insurance carrier will drop us. Our joint commission status will be compromised. Berkshire leaned back in his chair, studying Ashford over the top of his reading glasses. The child would be dead without that procedure. We don't know that. We know her airway was compromised. We know our attending physicians were exploring options. We know an emergency room staff member made an unauthorized intervention. Ashford slid a folder across the table. I'm recommending her immediate removal from the pediatric unit, suspension pending termination. She needs to be reassigned where she can do no further harm. What made it genius was the documentation. Ashford had spent his career learning how to build a case that looked airtight from the outside and felt inevitable from within. There was the incident report where Natalie had noted heavy metal poisoning as a differential diagnosis. He'd flagged it as overstepping scope of practice. There was the security footage of her accessing Emma's chart after her shift had ended, unauthorized access of protected health information. There was her temporary reassignment to night duty, which he'd framed as preparation for her eventual termination. Everything pointed in one direction. Natalie Hayes was a rogue employee who had created a pattern of insubordination that had escalated to performing unauthorized surgery. This goes to the board's legal counsel, Chen said, but his voice had shifted. The institutional machinery had already engaged. Ashford had shaped the narrative before anyone else could get a word in. By 1:34 a.m., Natalie was escorted from the pediatric floor by a security officer named Derek who wouldn't meet her eyes. He stood in the hallway with his hand resting on his belt, waiting while she emptied her locker. The scrubs came out first. Then the spare shoes. Then the small items that accumulate when you spend 12 hours a day somewhere, the lip balm, the granola bar she'd forgotten, the extra badge. And then the photograph. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds before sliding it into the cardboard box. 9 faces. 9 ghosts. Sergeant Tom Gator Holloway in the back row, his smile always slightly crooked. Captain Isaac Martinez in the front, the kind of man who could command respect with a single nod. Corporal James Chen next to him. Specialist Danny Wright. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Bellamy. Private First Class Garrett Shaw. Master Sergeant Cole Graves. And 2 others whose names she could recite in her sleep but whose faces had started to blur at the edges, the way grief works when you're trying to survive rather than remember. They'd extracted the senator's sons from a compound in Kandahar that shouldn't have existed on any map. They'd fought their way out with 47 rounds of 5.56 NATO ammunition, a field thoracotomy performed with a combat knife in her hands, and pure momentum. She'd made it. They hadn't. Your personal items, Derek said gently, handing her the cardboard box. Not your shift items. Personal items. As if her career here had been nothing but a collection of objects that fit in a box you could carry. The night shift supervisor, Patricia, had already left. Ashford had made sure of that. No witnesses to the actual termination. No one to contradict the narrative. Just Natalie and Derek and the fluorescent lights that suddenly felt far too bright. Good luck, Derek said quietly, and she understood that he meant it. He was a good man in an institution that had decided the good men would not interfere. The bus stop was 3 blocks away. Natalie walked past the emergency room entrance, past the ambulance bay, past the loading dock where deliveries happened at 6 in the morning. The rain was warm and smelled like diesel and concrete. It ran down her neck and soaked into her scrubs, and she didn't change pace. At 2:17 a.m., she stood under the bus shelter with the cardboard box pressed against her ribs and thought about what it meant to exist in the space between identities. Major Natalie Hayes had been officially erased 2 years ago. Nurse Natalie had just been ceremonially disposed of. And whatever came next would not be a person. It would be a ghost trying very hard to look human. The bus was for minutes late. Then 12 minutes late. Then it was 2:48 a.m. and Natalie realized she was going to have to get on that bus eventually, and when she did, she would disappear again. Not because the Marines had ordered it this time, but because disappearing had become the only shape her survival could take. The cardboard box felt heavier than it should have. The photograph of 9 dead Marines. The cracked coffee mug. The dying succulent. These were the contents of a life. These were the evidence that she had existed somewhere, meant something to someone, had been part of something that mattered. The next bus pulled up at 2:51 a.m. The doors hissed open with the sound of pneumatic pressure releasing. The driver, an older woman with grey hair pulled into a tight bun, glanced at Natalie and then away. Just another damp passenger at 3 in the morning. No one worth remembering. Natalie stepped toward the bus, her hand moving to grip the vertical pole for stability, and then the sound came. Not a vehicle. Not sirens. The sound of multiple helicopters approaching from the north, their rotors cutting the air with that specific rhythm that meant military insertion. Black Hawks. Possibly Osprey variants. Coming in fast and low enough that the windows of the bus shelter rattled. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She already knew what was coming. The question was only how, and whether it mattered anymore. What happened next would change everything. But first, she had to get on the bus, had to disappear, had to become invisible one more time. The bus driver looked annoyed at the helicopters. Natalie stepped up into the vehicle. Behind her, through the rain-soaked windows, the rotors became louder, the spotlight beams cutting through the darkness like searchlights at a prison break. But she was already inside. And when the bus pulled away from the curb, she was already gone. If you recognize yourself in Natalie's story, if you've ever been underestimated, overruled, or pushed aside despite knowing something the system missed, reach out to a veteran advocacy organization in your area. The ones who've sacrificed the most often need the most support coming home. Like and subscribe for more stories of the ones we almost lost. Comment below, what would you have done in Natalie's position?